Yeah, sorry for the delay there. So first talk of this session on lower bounds and private information retrieval is going to be from a paper by Marshall Ball and Tim Randolph. And it's a note on the complexity of private simultaneous messages with many parties. So maybe we'll try to reclaim, 6 minutes from the break so that everyone can have as much time as they're supposed to have. So great, take it away.
Awesome, thanks very much. Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So this is just a presentation of a note with a new lower bound on the complexity of private simultaneous messages with a bunch of parties. It's joint work by myself and Marshall Ball, now at NYU. So roadmap for this talk, I'm going to quickly go over the private simultaneous messages setting. Given the nature of this session, I expect a lot of people will be familiar with the basics, so I'll go relatively quickly. Then I'll talk about, at a high level, about the idea of the information squeezing argument that gets us lower bounds like this, and a particular measure of function complexity due to Necheporuk about 50 years ago. And then I'll talk briefly about the new results in this paper. So, private simultaneous messages setting. We can imagine we've got a bunch of parties, each of whom have an n-bit string. So k parties, n bits will be the parameters we're using for the duration of this talk, and they all have access to shared randomness. And what they want to do, they want to compute some kn-bit function, Boolean function f, but they don't want to share their private inputs with each other or with the referee. So the goal is that each person takes their n-bit input and encodes it in a message somehow, sends that message to the referee. We want the referee to be able to compute the original Boolean function, but to learn nothing else about the inputs beyond what it can learn from just the output of the function. So this is the setting we're interested in, and today we'll be talking about lower bounds. So in particular, the size of the messages that need to be sent to compute certain functions with these restrictions. So the formal definition that maps to that intuition is we've got a kn-bit Boolean function. We define some space of messages that players can send, a space of shared randomness, and a whole bunch of player functions, one for each player, that tell us when each player receives a certain input and the random string comes out a certain way, this is the message they send. We also define a ref function, so the referee will receive k messages from the player and compute some Boolean output, which should be the output of the function. So the two requirements we want a private simultaneous message protocol to have: the referee should give the correct output of the function on every input, no matter what the random string is. And one way of saying that the referee should learn nothing about the player's inputs beyond the output of the function is for every two inputs, such that the output of the function is the same, the message distribution should be identical over the randomness. It's possible to relax these definitions and get approximate correctness and security results, but it's usually simpler to think about it in the perfect correctness, perfect security world. So that's where I'll stay for this introduction. If we want to talk about private simultaneous message protocols in information theoretic terms, it's often easier to think about the same traditional definition in terms of a whole bunch of random variables. So in particular, you can have a random variable defined for every player, every party, and every n-bit input, which, depending on the randomness, evaluates to the message sent by that player on that particular input. So if you've got all of these random variables and they produce the messages with the same distribution as the player functions, then you've equivalently defined your private simultaneous message protocol. So this definition will make it easier to talk about the information contained in a PSM. The measurement we'll care about for this talk is the size of a PSM protocol, which is just the sum of the logs of the support of all of these random variables. So you could think of this as the entropy of all of these random variables. You could think of it as the sum of the channel widths needed by each player to send a message over the worst case message. Sorry, this is the sum on the worst case input, X. So this will be our starting setting that I'll be referring back to. And I'll try to give an intuitive presentation, but please stop me if you have questions about the notation I'm using or the assumptions I'm making. All right, so the PSM setting has been around for about 30 years. We've had, we began with a two-party case. We've had the k-party case for nearly as long. It's pretty natural. And recently, there have been a series of pretty strong results giving upper and lower bounds. So where n is 2, big N is 2 to the little n, we have PSM protocols for general functions with complexity big N to the k-1/2. And we have lower bounds that are linear in n in the two-party case, which also give lower bounds that are linear in k and n in the k-party case. So the question today that we'll be focused on is, intuitively, it seems like if we add more parties to this setting, if we have a bunch of people trying to collaborate to compute this function securely, the task should get harder. In particular, you would think as you add more parties, the difficulty of computing the function should increase more than linearly in the function size. So the approach we'll see today will give us a lower bound that's linear in n, but quadratic in k. So the approach we're using is heavily modeled off a paper by Ball, Holmgren, Liu, Ishai, and Malkin about a couple of years ago. And I want to give full credit to this paper because ours uses a lot of similar techniques. So to start with this argument, we need the notion of a restriction. If you've got some Boolean function, a restriction is just that function evaluated on a subset S of the bits with the rest of the bits fixed by the vector Z. So I'm going to use the notation F sub S given Z to mean a restriction to the bits indicated by S with the other bits fixed to Z. So I expect this is a familiar concept, but an example would be if we've got some 8-bit function and we restrict that function to the first, third, sixth, and seventh bits with the second, fourth, fifth, and eighth bits fixed to 1, 1, 0, 0, we turn our 8-bit function into a 4-bit function. And this will be useful to us because of the idea that distinct restrictions, so different restrictions that result from restricting disjoint subsets of the input, will contain different information. So if I'm restricting to a completely different subset of the input and I create a different function, the information required to distinguish that function from other restrictions on the same bits is going to be separate from the information I'll need to distinguish other restrictions on other subsets of the input. So to think about this intuitively, using the setting in the previous paper, we can consider a k-party PSM in which every party has exactly 1 bit. If you're familiar, you can think of this as a decomposable randomized encoding. So here we've got k parties. They're computing a k-bit function. They've each got 1 bit, and they need to send an encoded message to the referee in such a way that the referee can recover the output of the function without learning anything about it. Our observation about restrictions and the observation that will power our lower bounds is if two different restrictions on the same bit set, so restrictions to S on Z and Z prime, give the same output on a certain input, then the perfect security requirement forces all of the parties whose bits are fixed, the parties not in S, to send identical message distributions on Z and on Z prime. So otherwise, we would violate the requirement that Z and Z prime should give identical message distributions to the referee on this input X. So what this means is if all the parties not in S have to send identical message distributions on these restrictions, then for any two restrictions that create different functions, any two distinct restrictions, the referee has to be able to tell the difference given only information sent by parties in S. So in a way, we've been able to argue that just these bits that our function has been restricted to, these parties in S, are the ones whose messages must contain enough information to distinguish between the restriction to S that uses Z and the restriction to S that uses Z prime. So the more distinct restrictions we have to our subset of players S, the more information the players in S must send. And that's the intuition that makes a particular measure of function complexity useful to us. So you can measure the complexity of a function in a particular way defined by Nechiporuk about 50 years ago, in which we define little g of some subset S of the input for a function f to be the log of the number of distinct non-zero restrictions of f to S. So this will be a counter, essentially, of the number of distinct restrictions to this subset of input bits. And we'll take the maximum value, the measure will be the sum over all subsets of a partition of this measure. So it'll count the number of distinct non-zero restrictions over the worst case partition of the input bits. Intuition being, again, that these different sets in the partition, we need to be able to distinguish between the distinct restrictions, and the distinct restrictions on disjoint bit sets contain different information. So we can then take this insight, and the contribution of this particular note is taking this insight and making the appropriate modifications to apply it to the many-party private simultaneous messages setting. So we're still restricting bits, but if we like, we can think about it as restricting the inputs of certain parties. So we can observe that if two restrictions of the same set of parties in the private simultaneous messages setting coincide on at least one input, the parties not in S have to send the same message distribution on both restrictions, is what that should say. So we've got a similar insight here. As in the one-bit case, the parties in S have to send enough information to tell distinct restrictions apart. A modified version of Nechipuruk's complexity measure for these functions will capture that information. So it'll amount to a lower bound on the channel widths, the size of this PSM that's necessary. So I can come back to the precise reasoning behind this, but the appropriate abstraction turns out to be restrict all of the bits except for one bit of each party in your set of parties S. Then modify little g and big G slightly and end up with a slightly modified measure of function complexity. I think for the purposes of making the talk intelligible, I would think about this with the same intuition as the first measure of function complexity. So fix a partition of the input into different sets of parties and consider the amount of information that those parties have to send to distinguish between different restrictions on their input bits. So we can then argue, information theoretically, that this measure of function complexity is a lower bound on the size of PSM schemes. So if we've got some PSM for a kn-bit Boolean function, then the size of the PSM has to be bigger than this measure divided by 2. So this is relatively close to an equivalence. The way we'll argue this is, once again, we'll define our PSM as a family of random variables. We'll observe that this function little g exactly captures the entropy of a uniform distribution over a representative set of distinct restrictions to the party set S. So in other words, the amount of information needed to distinguish between those different restrictions. We reason that the entropy of that distribution has to be somehow contained. The information needed to distinguish between those distinct restrictions has to be contained in the messages sent by S. And then we can reason that each set of parties, there are lower bounds on the amount of information they have to send. So that's a sketch of how this proof of the lower bound works. So to show that certain functions, any PSM for certain functions must be at least this size, it remains to just show that they have large function complexity by this particular metric. So it turns out that almost all random kn-bit Boolean functions have size at least k squared n over a log factor. There's at least 2 other explicit functions. So functions that generally have chi complexity, like testing if a bunch of multisets are disjoint, or using a small input to index into a Boolean matrix indirectly. These are 2 explicit functions that have large function complexity by this measure. So it is indeed possible to get a roughly k squared n lower bound on function complexity using this measure. So it is true that every kn-bit Boolean function has Necheporuk function complexity measure of at most k squared n over log kn. So any further progress might require, at the very least, defining a better measure of function complexity. If not going further, we might wonder if it's possible to get better lower bounds. I think Marshall has speculations on that, but frankly, I can't follow all of them. So I'll have to defer those particular questions. And you might also wonder, we've seen that you can take this particular measure of function complexity, make a few tweaks, and get lower bounds in new settings relatively easily. So you might wonder, can you get lower bounds on things like branching programs or formulas or other similar settings where you might be able to use an information squeezing argument? So I will wrap up there. Thank you for listening.
Any questions? So maybe I'll ask one quickly, Tim. What is the best, so could you remind me, what's the best upper bound we have in this setting?
Yeah, so the best upper bound is unsurprisingly far above the lower bound. So I think to the best of my knowledge, the upper bound is like 2 to the little n times k-ish. It's this general PSM protocol. So much, much bigger than the k squared n lower bound.
And what's Marshall's speculation on the lower bound? Is it?
So my memory of this, Marshall is here, but he doesn't have to talk if he doesn't want to, is that.
So yeah, we have, I mean, you can formulate some sort of natural proofs barrier to getting above k squared n. So in some sense, you will need an unnatural argument, or you will prove that certain PRFs are not exponentially secure, basically. Is the gist.
Awesome.
Right, we have PRF candidates that, to our knowledge, are very, very strong, that have very succinct PSMs. So they have like k squared times n massive like size. So if you can prove this natural proofs argument will say, like, if you can prove a stronger lower bound, then in some sense this will give you a distinguisher for these PRFs.
Got it. Makes sense.
Hey, so but is there any barrier against proving a lower bound against a non-explicit function, just a random function? I mean, even this seems to be hard, and I don't see how a natural proof barrier is relevant in this case. It's not, right? Oh.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Thanks.